Dr. Jazz.
Seth,
Yes, how are you?
Dr. Jazz.
thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've talked to so many guys that you played and have you on so many records, and I saw you live also, like I think in Maribor here in my hometown.
Oh, you're in Maribor. Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah, I was like your band with Brötzmann and Joe McPhee
Oh, yeah.
and Ken
And
Kessler, I think.
Kessler,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. That was a burning gig, by the way.
Thank you.
But I'll just jump in and like we wrote to each other, we'll have a
Sure.
free impro. I
Okay.
mean, I wanted to ask you about, I mentioned seeing you in Maribor with Peter, and Peter passed away recently. And how does I know you guys worked a lot. I have you on so many albums with the Tintet or many other connections. How does your story with Peter begin? Actually, when did you guys play for the first time? And
I think we played for the first time in I want to say 98 or 97. The first group was with the Chicago Octet before it became the Tentet. But prior to that, I played with him in a trio with Hamid Drake.
Oh, really?
And we did a little tour of Europe, and yeah, there's nothing recorded of that, or nothing released, I should say. But and then at the same time, near 97 or 98, we were starting this octet. He was coming to Chicago, and we did some concerts and some recordings then, and then quickly turned into the Tentet, and then that went for 14 years, which was fantastic.
Yeah. How was it like for you to play with him? I mean, he, at least in Europe, I don't know, obviously in Chicago, he kind of grew the status also in the States, but like in Europe, he had a huge status of a free jazz. I hate this term, but I have to use it. Like, since the Machine Gun, late 60s, big name in the scene, like playing with him, especially stylistically, how was it for you? Sometimes gigs for drummers with him can be really intense. Like, what was your experience like?
Well, it was really intense for sure. That was a given going in. Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting because sure, when I started to play with him, he already was, been playing for 30 years or something, and has established himself as, what he has been doing. I don't even know what to say about it. It was a very intense experience. It was a learning experience. I was coming into it, knowing his music, but there's nothing like standing on a stage with him to hear his sound and his depth and his intensity. So yeah, it was fantastic. The Tentet, the Octet, and then the Tentet was also another great experience because of all the wonderful musicians that were in those bands. And there were a lot, aside from, there were more than 10. And the way it sort of worked across those, I think, roughly 14 years of the existence of that band, the first 7 years, we were playing compositions of the members of people in the group, including Peter's. And that was Hamid was playing drums, the other drum, and then Mars Williams was in that group. And then we had a lot of guests, William Parker and Roy Campbell and some others that sat in every once in a while. And then the second 7 years, Hamid was no longer there, or Mars. Paul Nelson Love came as the other drummer, but also this is when Johannes Bauer and
the Europeans,
the European guys, and Perolke came. So it was, and then at that point we stopped playing compositions. We started playing free improvisation, which was really fantastic. I enjoyed the compositions. That was very challenging, and there were, since everyone was writing, there was all these different approaches to composing for basically for improvisers. But when the free improvisation came, it was fantastic because on the one hand, you had all these really high level, amazing musicians, but to have 10, 11, 12 people on the stage and to do free improvisation, that's very demanding. And it was, in a way, the great part of it was to see, you know, everyone fall on their face. All these great players, you know, it took a while for that to become something and to really feel like, you know, okay, we really could do this. Interesting things happened, like when we got rid of the compositions, we also got rid of all the music stands, and we rarely played with like a stage full of microphones unless we were playing in a really large venue. And everyone was able, aside from the two drums, the bass and the cello, those were sort of fixed in space, but everyone else could just move around. And so you had this sort of this great, I like to call it flocking murmurations, you know, where people could just move into different physical places on the stage, and different smaller ensembles would emerge and dissolve, and the next thing would happen. And it was very challenging, but also very rewarding.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I saw him live so many times, and you know, it was always, he had his sound, of course, that was him, you know, it's like, but it was always different, you know. It's beautiful player, very unique also. I mean, influenced so many guys, obviously, that came after him, you know, the whole Scandinavian scene, and I think in Holland and so many other people. So
yes, I mean, we talk about it in terms, Peter, in terms of like his influence on free jazz and what have you, but he also influenced noise music.
Yeah.
He also influenced the punks. You know, his influences, especially now after he passed, and I've been reflecting a lot, and also seeing all the tributes and what people are saying. I mean, he was his influence was so broad, more than just, you know, European free music. And then also his son Casper, I mean, when they played together, and just all these different streams and genres, whatever you want to call them, he was such a profound influence on these people, on these scenes. And I think that will be one of his legacies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, especially as a horn player, on so many horn players.
Well, yeah, horn players for sure, but
you know, to liberate them, like what you can actually, you know, do, don't give a fuck, like actually what you're, go for it, and just I think that's important. Yeah, but Michael, I wanted to ask you something, like, how did you, I mean, I checked today the records I have you on, and there's like a whole bunch of records from the 90s and 2000s on, and like, and I noticed, like, from the 80s I don't have any, and I checked your website also, like, how did you first, like, two longer questions. How did you enter the improvised music, actually? What was the main trigger for you that you decided to investigate this scene, and especially, you know, in Chicago, that entrance into the scene and getting to know people, like basically your beginning story? And
well, I mean, it's interesting for me. I came to music late. I started playing music when I was 17. Prior to that, I was a great music fan, but I never thought, it never occurred to me to play music. My family was very musical, and my father, my mother, and also one of my younger brothers was sort of a savant. And I was very content with being, you know, a listener. And then when I was 16, 17, I did this hitchhiking tour after I finished high school, and I went from Chicago, hitchhiked to San Francisco with the first stop.
Okay.
And then in San Francisco, I was able to see a concert of Rahsaan Roland-Kirk. This was in 1976, a year before he passed, about a year and a half before he passed. And I don't know, I've talked about it before in different interviews and what have you. I don't really know how to talk about it, except to say that it sort of changed my DNA, that concert, because here was a guy at this point, Roland-Kirk had I guess he had a stroke, and he couldn't use half of his. He couldn't use his left arm, I think. And so he was still playing two saxophones, but with just one hand. And, you know, they sort of brought him in and put him on a stool, helped him onto the stool. And then he played for about 2 sets, these really long sets. And I have to say, I don't remember anything about the actual tunes or who was in the band. I mean, I know now because I went and researched it, but for the longest time that none of that stuff mattered. But what was the most amazing thing, and this is what set me off really on playing music, was that he became sort of like this this crystal point in time and space where energies would come in and be purified and go out, and it just washed through me. I don't really know any other way to talk about it, and changed me. And I had it, you know, I was transformed. And that was the first time I guess I realized, aside from other things, the one thing I realized was that arts, music specifically, not only can be entertaining and interesting, but it can be a transformative thing. And I think we think of contemporary music, what have you, but if you look at music over the last, whatever, 6,000 years, primarily, it's a transformative, magical thing. It's very difficult to understand how that's happening or why that's happening, but it's certainly happening. This idea of like being bathed in vibrations, it really is profound. So I walked out of that concert, literally. I walked out of that concert saying, that's what I want to do. Now, I had no idea what that was or how to go about it. I mean, do I play the saxophone? Is it music, you know, like this necessarily, this type of music, or and so I finished that trip, which lasted about 4 months. I went all the way up to nearly Alaska and across Canada and back down to Chicago. So, and when I got back to Chicago, I picked up a darbuka, which was a hand drum that my father played, and it was around the house. And shortly after, I met this one guy that when I started to go to university, that was a violinist and kind of a crazy guy and sort of a, you know, and he was just about a year or so older than me. His name was Daniel Scanlon, and I played with him a lot. And we started just making improvisations on the darbuka and the violin. And a lot of it was terrible because I was just learning. He was pretty good violinist, but he was so out. And he also introduced me to a lot of, you know, graphic scores, contemporary classical composers. But he had such a breadth of knowledge of all different types of music. So that was a real kick in the pants, you know. But I started as an improviser, albeit not a very good one.
Yeah, but that's quite interesting.
Wow. You have to start somewhere, right? But I had no formal music training. I had piano lessons when I was a kid, but other than that, I didn't. So by the time I was like 18 or 19, I decided that I was going to go to a music conservatory here in Chicago at Roosevelt University, as my friend Ken Kessler was going there. And I know since I was 16, 17. And it was very interesting to me because he was like, yeah, I'm going to go to music school. I'm like, oh, they have schools for this? You can do this as a living? Because in my family, we always played music. And my father, who was a amateur musician, but he was always, his attitude was, you know, this is something we do for fun. You don't do this for your living. And so when I announced that I wanted to go to music school, on the one hand, he was very supportive, but he was a little confused. You know, he was like, well, why do you have to go to school? Just play. But I needed to go to school for myself. And Roosevelt University at the time was a very, I would say, you know, a rigorous classical music conservatory, where people that were studying there were either studying to be composers or most of them were studying to play in the orchestra. Now, I had no desire to play in an orchestra necessarily, but I remember the first time walking into the percussion room, just, you know, when I was checking the school out, and I walked into this huge room with all of these percussion instruments, probably 80% of which I could not even tell you what they were. So this is how green I was when I went there. And so I started, you know, for about 3.5 years studying percussion. I was also studying composition.
Oh, okay.
So I had a dual major, which was ridiculously ambitious for someone who never had any musical training. But first year and a half was difficult. I had to live in there. I mean, sleep under the piano and learn how to sight sing intervals and things that were all mystical to me. I didn't, when the first time I had to learn how to hear intervals, I didn't know what they were listening for.
Yeah.
That's a minor six. I'm like, whoa, okay. All I'm hearing is vibrations, but after a while, of course, it stuck, and I went through that, and I'm really glad I did, and I'm really also glad I did it in a real rigorous classical place. I was already a free brain. I didn't need to, go someplace where they were like, create your own curriculum and improvise as much as you want. I was already doing that. And at the same time, I started accompanying dance classes, modern dance classes, and, primarily doing percussion and a little piano, and eventually opening up some instrumentation just so I could, keep myself interested, because I was working maybe 40, 60, 80 hours a week sometimes.
Okay. Yeah.
And for a young musician, it was fantastic, actually, because on the one hand, it's pretty basic what you needed to provide the class, for their exercises, for their phrases. On the other hand, I was able to work on my techniques. I was able to look with my eyes. And then the other thing from when I talk about Roland Kirk and how to do that, again, I was so in the dark about even how to start, but I guess I knew on some level that any performing art, whether it's music, dance, acting, anything you do on a stage in front of people, there's a common thread that goes through it all. Of course, the techniques are different, the practices are different, what have you, but at the end of the day, you have to get on a stage with the energy of an audience, the energy of your other performers, and, create something. And so dance became very important to me. I started almost immediately after starting to be an accompanist, to start to compose things for friends of mine who were choreographers.
Oh, wow.
And that was also a great introduction to composition for me, because on the one hand, I didn't have to create music from scratch. If someone had a piece of choreography, I would watch it, I would take notes, I would take timings, and then a form would already be there, would appear for me. So then I could fill in the form with what I thought would work with instrumentation and all the other parameters. Yeah, I mean, so I started as an improviser. I got a formal education, even though it was a little difficult for me to do that, not having any training. And also, I was, all the other kids have been playing music since they were little kids, and they were all headed toward the orchestra. I was very fortunate to have a great percussion teacher and two great composition teachers. But the percussion teacher he was dead set on, I was sort of the teacher's pet. He was dead set on getting me to be, the timpanist in the lyric opera. I was like, oh, dude, I don't want to do that. Like, of course you do. So I think I disappointed him a little bit, but and then as things progressed, I was developing. I was during my 20s, I was developing as a musician. So I decided at the time, this is in the 1980s, there was not many venues for some reason. Chicago's a very rich musical city, but in the 1980s, there was sort of this bottoming out of venues.
Okay.
And so a friend of mine who ran a dance space, a place called Lynx Hall, which I'm still affiliated with, he said, I'm sick and tired of booking dance. Why don't you book some stuff here? So I decided that starting in 1985, I booked experimental music Fridays and Saturday nights, and poetry and fiction readings on Thursday nights. So I did that from 1985 to 1988. And it was great for me because on the one hand, I was a young musician. I was not really ready. I mean, I was playing, of course, and performing with my friends and what have you, but I was developing. But also during that time, I was able to sort of fill this void of performance, because there was times I'd have to drive to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to see some group that was coming from Europe or coming from the East Coast or someplace, because there was no venue for them in Chicago. And I thought it was crazy, right? So that was really very good for me. And I saw a lot of music. I heard tons of stuff. I met all of these musicians. And at the same time, I was able to, continue to develop as a musician. So that made it a good, fertile period.
What was then this renaissance, at least in my eyes, that happened in Chicago in the early or mid 90s? I mean, when I look at all the guys that kind of you popped out, like obviously you were doing the work already before, but you and Dave Rempis and Ken Vandermark and Kent, all these amazing players, Mars Williams, Jeb Bishop, Fred Longberg. I mean, the list goes on. Like, what was happening then in that era that suddenly, you started to create so much music? And
well, the thing that's interesting with Chicago, like during the 80s, and there's a lot of great musicians here in all genres of music, and it was I think it was a very lively scene. And also, I would say in the 1980s, at least from my perspective, the arts scenes in Chicago were much more integrated together. So, for instance, I mean, Lynx Hall was trying to do something specific with experimental music and poetry and fiction readings, but, any other events were like, you'd go to an art opening, and then after that, there would be performance art. And then after that, there'd be music. And it was all in the same place, and 500 people would show up. And it was I knew all the painters, I knew the poets, I knew, the theater folks. And it was very interesting to see, what I was working on as a musician, and to see at the same time what the painters were working on, or the poets, or the theater folks. And as it got into the 90s, things became more in their own place. So the theater scene in Chicago, for instance, exploded because you can do it yourself at the time. You could do it yourself here very easily. So a theater company would just get like a storefront, and they'd live there, and they'd rehearse there, and then they'd do their shows there. And same with music. And there was a big push to all of a sudden find places for each of these genres, as opposed to like one big sloppy scene. I don't know if that's better or worse, but it was a very interesting time. Also, at the beginning of the 90s, you had people like John Corbett, Peter Marczak, writers that were actually writing about the music. Prior to that, there was nothing. There was, in a way, Chicago is a little bit provincial in that way, that there was not so much attention paid. I mean, I remember in the 80s going to New York City, because I had a lot of friends there, and playing little crappy concerts literally in holes in the ground, storage spaces. And, there were 3 or 4 people would show up to the concert, but one of them was writing for the Village Voice or some other small paper. And it was like, wow, okay. And the bands weren't necessarily good, but they were being written about.
Yeah.
And there was nothing like that in Chicago. I mean, at the time, in the 80s, there was a few things, but very, very few, mostly jazz writers. But starting in the 90s, a big attention started to shift because writers came and started talking about it. Yeah. And then also, the whole like rock scene really started to take off in the 1990s. So all of a sudden, all this attention was being paid to Chicago, aside from the experimental stuff and the underground stuff. So it became like this kind of fertile time for everybody. And then, I think Vandermark moved here around that time from Boston. I think, a lot of us also were just at the age. The AACM was very active, and with like I think that was the third generation of players. And what I tried to do at Lynx Hall when I was doing that series in the 80s was bring, because that was on the north side, and Chicago was a big city laid out, you know, and the ASM was based on the south side, but I tried to bring that kind of stuff up to the north side. Fred Anderson was a real major person here in Chicago, not just as an amazing musician and artist, but just someone who, you know, he had a place called the Velvet Lounge for the longest time, but prior to that, he had a place called the Birdhouse, which was on the north side, because Fred actually lived in Evanston. And, you know, I was 15, 16 years old going to the Birdhouse, watching all these amazing musicians, you know, and that was such an education. So,
well, you mentioned Ken, and I wanted to ask you about two associations. I mean, or three actually, that I see that, you know, you kept for such a long time. Like you mentioned Kent already before, Kessler. When did you again start to hook up with him and playing with Vandermark, obviously in the 90s with the quartet? And also, like, I did this talk the other day with Fred Lonbger-Holm, and you two guys also seem to have like a really long musical relationship. Like, how did these stories with these guys begin? I mean,
well, with Kent, I met him, like I said, I met him when I was 16, 17 years old, and we'd been playing together literally ever since. We never
so also
stopped.
In the 80s, you kept on playing, like.
Yes, all through
really?
the 80s.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's maybe not a lot of recorded stuff, although there's some. But yeah, we were tight, and we were. He was, you know, you always, when you start, at least the way it was for me, you have a small group of musicians that you work with and that are at your same level or a little bit beyond you or a little bit, you know, coming up behind you or whatever. But it's a group, and definitely Kent and I were in that group. Fred came, I think, in the mid-90s. But we played a concert. The first time I played together, I heard from Elliott Sharp that Frederick Lonbger-Holm was moving to Chicago, and he's a cellist, and he recommended that the two of us work together. And I always thank Elliott Sharp for that. That was a good call. Yeah, we hit it off immediately, and then we played together a ton. If you take, you know, he just moved a couple of years ago away from Chicago. But during the time he was here, you know, he was in the Tentet. But aside from that, we played together all sorts of things. I can't even. we did a series of trio records where Fred and I would play with someone else, and there was, you know, Jaap Blanc and Stan Sandel, and I'm going to forget them all now. There's about 5 or 6 of them, of course, with Joe McPhee later.
Yeah, I love that band.
Survival Unit 3. But that was a sort of a fixed band. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening there. And Ken Vandermark had moved here, and Kent and I were playing together. And I think Kent was playing with Ken and Hal Russell NRG Ensemble. And he suggested that we should do something with Ken, and that's how the quartet started. I don't know what to say. It was like a fertile time. We're all sort of roughly the same age, and and the scene was becoming very open. And the other thing that's interesting about Chicago that I've always found it to be very healthy is that I was talking before about like the writers and what have you, and how it's sort of provincial. On the one hand, it's not a media center like New York or Berlin, or Paris, or something, or Los Angeles. And consequently, what happens is that it's a great place to develop because the pressure is sort of off. On the other hand, because the pressure is off, it's no big deal to just like play with anybody. I would play, there was a lot of great blues musicians here, R&B musicians, reggae musicians, Latin musicians. So you play with everybody, heavy metal musicians. It becomes like, it's no big deal. It's just everyone's on the scene, you know each other, and like, oh, hey, I like what you do. I like what you do. Well, let's try to do it together. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, okay, we'll move on to the next thing. It wasn't so high pressure. And I think that that's a great thing about Chicago and the Chicago music scene. Everyone's really pretty open to helping each other. It's not like I have to protect my turf. You know what I mean? It's not
sure.
live in that way. And then, of course, because it's not a media center.
What about you as a drummer? You know, when I hear you play or watch you, you're like I mean, if I watch you, you're like a painter or a dancer sometimes, you know. But when I close my eyes, it's like I think this percussive influence is so present, but yet also I don't know how to describe your playing. You sometimes create so much tension with nothing almost, yet you can then build it up again. How did you learn with the drums then? Did you also check out other drummers? Like, did you go back to, I don't know, Sciamachy or the older generation, like of free guys, or what was your story when investigating the drums?
Well, like I said, I started with the darabuka and a lot of Middle Eastern hand drums, the frame drums and what have you. And that was my main road into it. And then when I started at the conservatory, I finally got my hands on everything else, including the drum set, but, you know, the mallet instruments and orchestral chimes, everything, timpani. So it was fascinating learning these orchestral instruments and seeing all the sonic possibilities. And immediately I knew that I didn't want to be an orchestral player. I didn't necessarily want to be a jazz player either. What really fascinated me was sound and texture. So I came at it as a percussionist, really. And just exploring all the different sounds you can make from given material, that became what was fascinating to me. Also, at the same time, I was listening to a lot of, you know, electronic music. Now, I don't play electronics at all, but I was really influenced by electronics. So to make a snare drum sound like, you know, a sine wave, that was like a goal of the week, you know. So there were a lot of things like that. I really was trying to extend, not just learn the instruments, the percussion instruments, which is already a huge task because there are so many, but also to figure out ways to extend the sounds through extended techniques. And really, for me, that's like a lifelong exploration. It's endless.
Yeah, sure.
You know, it seems that way.
Yeah,
that's how I got into it. And then also, I always was an improviser first. I started composing, but that really came later. But the idea for me, what music was playing with other people and interacting with other people. That's why I finally, when I turned 60, I finally did my first solo record. It just never occurred to me before, or I should say it occurred to me, but it wasn't something that I was so attracted to, because really from the first day, my idea of playing music was to play with other people. I did solo. What are you talking about solo? That would be, I'd be a painter if I wanted to just sit around by myself.
Oh. You mentioned composing. You know, I love that group you had, the Blue Lights, because
thanks.
I mean, the band obviously is fantastic. Like, you know, Rempis and Mars Williams and Josh Berman and Kent Kessler. All these guys are just monsters on their instruments. But like, also your compositions that, you know, I love especially the melodies you came up with, like that Dancing Cigarettes. You know, it's kind of like in Toru or what, I forget the titles. But like, how did you approach like that record, which is, I mean, it's open, but it's still composed, a lot of it, like lots of melodies.
Well, it's all composed. I mean, there's some open solos, what have you. But for that record, for that project, first off, yes, you're absolutely right. Dave Rempis, Mars Williams, Josh Berman, Kessler, I mean, they're great players. So I knew that I had, I put that specifically together sort of to feature Mars Williams, because I'd known him since 1980, and I really... Amazing. And we played in a bunch of little things together, projects and what have you, but I wanted to be in a band with him and sort of feature him. But so I knew I had improvisers. So that was sort of the easy part in a way. So It's interesting because for many years I went back and forth from being a drummer, like with the Middle Eastern music. I played with my father and my brother. We'd play weddings and parties, and I played in belly dancing clubs and what have you. This is dance music.
Mm. Yeah.
And you might play 2, 3, 4 hours and people dance. And then I went on this path of like improvisation, exploring textures and sounds. And I remember there was a point where I did like almost for 2 years, I was touring, and every approach, every gig that I was playing, the approach was this kind of sound and texture and noises and interactions with other, improvising with other musicians. And at one point I'm like, I was just, I want to play a beat. I want people to dance. What's the matter with me? I'm supposed to be a drummer. Nobody's dancing. That's definitely a modern dilemma. That's not the way it was for the previous 5,000 years,
Yeah.
So anyway, the Blue Lights, I wanted to write music that was simply, I wanted to write interesting melodies that were catchy, and also it's just rhythm and melody.
Mm-hmm.
Really simple things, or sort of take it back and to have this almost like, I don't know, a party band.
Yeah, no harmonic instrument also, obviously. So that's
nice
thing
it was real pure. It was sort of from the Middle Eastern, also just the rhythm and melody, stacked harmonies, and it was great. And I always thought of that band like a band that would play at a jazz festival, but not on the main stage, but at the after party. But of course, getting paid as much as the main stage. So that was the fantasy anyway. And it was fun for the years I did it. And we created a couple of good books. We made one good album and then a companion set. And, if I have an issue with anything, it's like after a while, I get bored easily. So once I did that, we toured, we did 3, 4 tours. Okay, I felt like I'd accomplished what I was, setting out to do with that. And it was fun. And I have to say, I still love that music. It's fun to listen to. It's fun to play. It was really, really fun to write, just because it was different than everything else that I was doing.
Do you still write, by the way, or compose?
Oh, yeah. I still compose. I mean, composition for me, like I said, in the early days, it was all composing for theater, dance, puppet theater. And I really learned a lot. And when you're working with another art form, composing music for something that's going to be another kind of stage presentation, it's a different thing than just composing a piece of music from scratch. For me, anyway, it was then as I got older and I learned a lot from that way of composing. But then it was also like that when it came time to writing my own music, I write a lot of chamber music, and it sits in a drawer.
Really? Oh wow! Okay.
I've written a lot of stuff that it doesn't see the light of day primarily because of economics. And also I got into, in the mid 80s through the 90s, through the 2000s, I was touring all the time. So the idea of like putting together an ensemble and having them paid and rehearsed, there was never enough time, and there was never, ever enough money.
Yeah.
And I know that I have a lot of good friends that are musicians that would probably come and do these long, nasty rehearsals and, for nothing or for very little, but I can't bring myself to not pay people. It's just not, I don't think it's ethical in a lot of ways to, even if they're willing, even if they're happy to do it for free. So
do you like it, leading bands otherwise? I mean, like,
do I like what?
Leading bands, being a band leader.
Yeah, I don't mind it. I mean, so much of my life in music has been improvisation where there's no real leader.
Yeah, like kind of bands.
And that's what I prefer. I like the where the hierarchy dissolves as far as the instrumentation, for sure. Being a drummer, I can be the melodic content or whatever, all that aesthetic, but also just I like that the kind of collective approach to the music and also then the band and the logistics of that stuff. I mean, someone usually has to take charge if it's just for technical things like booking tickets or whatever, but otherwise when you get on the stage, you really feel like you're a part of something, you're a part of a whole, and that's really special.
Yeah, that's important, for the music as well. Like you mentioned touring, and when was the first time you went to Europe? And you know, I think you toured so much, like you said, in the late 90s and 2000s. Like, how do you keep fresh then on gigs? You know, being an improviser, you have to be creative in a sense, I mean, like all the time. What was your idea when staying fresh and keep it, you know, in the zone, like every gig? And
yeah, well, the first time I was in Europe was 1982, and that was with a theater company.
Okay.
And we were in Belgium for like a 3-week residency there, and then also in England around that time. But then really starting to come with the music, it was probably in the late 80s, early 90s. I forget exactly what it was or where, but as far as keeping fresh, I mean, here's the thing. Musicians have been touring under shitty circumstances for 6,000 years.
True, yeah. True.
Right?
Yeah.
When you get on a stage and it's time for you to perform, you're there to do that. You're not there to complain or be tired or be blah, 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 whatever. I understand that it affects you, but all the travel and the rigor and the nonsense. But it's like there's 24 hours in a day. 2 of those hours are on a stage, and everything is focused to that. So if you're traveling and you're going through nightmare and you haven't slept and you haven't done this, you have to figure out a way that those 2 hours you're right there for the whole time. You might be dead afterwards, you know. So I always thought of it like that. It's just focus on those 2 hours, and everything else is just nonsense. For the rest of the time, I'm baggage. Know, baggage with a book.
Byrne said once we talked to Tim Byrne, and he said, like, we're basically paid to travel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean the music's on the house. You have to pay for all the nonsense.
Exactly, for losing the luggage and whatever.
Yeah, but it's really important what you're saying. I mean, especially with improvised music, but with any music or any performance, you know, when you're on the stage, there's people there. They come to see you. They arrange their lives around coming, paying money, what have you, to sit there, and you have to be there. You have to be present and bring all your energy, and there's just no excuses. If you get to the point where you're so burned out that you're, you know, literally exhausted and you can't function, you shouldn't do it. It's not fair to yourself. It's not fair to the other musicians. It's certainly not fair to the audience. So if you put yourself in a position where your tour schedule is just so crazy, then it's your fault. Ultimately.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes there's no way around it. If you want to work, you have to do it that way. But you're not doing anyone any favors if you're exhausted and you can't function at your highest level. What's the point?
True. Yeah, true. Yeah. Michael, I wanted to ask you about also your collaboration with Hamid Drake. And are you guys still doing the Winter Solstice, or?
Yeah, we're doing the Winter Solstice. This year will be our 33rd annual.
Ooh.
So we're doing it for 33 years. But I actually started playing with him prior to that. I started playing with him in 1988.
Already.
And it's interesting. I have a younger brother who's a sound engineer and does live concert sounds. And he used to work with Hamid in the reggae scene, because Hamid is an amazing reggae drummer. I don't know if you play reggae, but so in the 80s, my brother was always telling me, hey, there's this guy Hamid, you really got to meet him. And finally we hooked up in 1988. I invited Hamid to do just a short piece on a benefit concert for this place, Lynx Hall, that I talked about earlier. We played like a 20-minute frame drum duet.
Oh, wow.
Just improvised, and it was just magic for both of us. And it was magic for me. Hopefully it was magic for him. He stuck around, so I'm guessing he liked it too. Yeah, and that's been a really rich, I mean, he's such an amazing drummer. He has such a range. musician, artist, philosopher, thinker. So it's been a joy to be in his presence. And then we've also been, of course, with the Tentet for those first 7 years, but also a few other projects where we were the tandem drummers. And that's always been, he's wonderful to play with. He's wonderful to be with. He's a family friend. Like I said, he knew my younger brother before I even met him. He knew my mother and father before I even met him. So, we were close. And he just, he's not around Chicago so much anymore, but we still stay in touch, and we still do this winter solstice for sure.
Yeah, and I love him because when you mentioned, playing drums for people to dance, it's always when you hear him play, even if it's, with Brötzmann or Mats Gustafsson or whoever, like of the crazy guys, he has this pulse like behind it, and it's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'm dancing,
He's masterful. He's something.
Yeah. But Michael, what's on the schedule for you for this year still? And any plans like touring, new records, or coming to Europe maybe even, or?
Well, I mean, new records, that's what's I've been working on recently. I just finished mixing this project with a French pianist named Sophie Agnal.
Okay, no, don't know.
I've known her for many years, and we've, in festivals and what have you, we've become friends, but it was the first time we just got to play together this past April, and it was here in Chicago. She was coming through with this bridge project, which is a thing between Chicago and France, exchange musicians, different ensembles. And she was in town, and so we decided we were able to do this duo concert in a recording studio, experimental sound studio. And it was fantastic. It was the first time we got to play together, and it was just clicked right off the bat. And the recording was really wonderful, and the music we both really enjoying the music. So I just finished mixing that, and hopefully we'll get that released. I started this other group, this other recording project here with 4 different musicians that are coming from, I would say, more like the rock scene, or and also like performance artists.
Oh, okay.
So their music, definitely it's a musical group, but it's also just a little off of what I've been, and it really pushed me in a different direction. And it was great for them to have this kind of really nice recording session. And I'll be working a lot on that, mixing and mastering that coming up. I just released something with the Bhutanese guitarist Tashi Dorji.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. And it was something we recorded a few years ago, but it just saw the light of day on a vinyl on Feeding Tube Records. And that was the second project actually I did with him. There was the first one I did with C. Spencer Ye, and that was in 2017, I believe. What's coming up? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not traveling so much this year. I was in Montreal for the festival up there just in May. I'm drawing a blank here.
But for tours, do you have some upcoming tours for Europe also, or?
I spend a lot of time in Berlin.
Really?
I don't have any tours coming, but I always go back to Berlin at least once a year. So probably in the fall, I will go back there. That's sort of my second musical home. And I played with so many musicians there. So I always try to find the new musicians, and there's always a new venue coming up. I play, at least once or twice a year. I go to Berlin, and so probably I'll do that in the fall. Yeah, right now, no other big touring projects.
Yeah,
I'm sure something will come up, but
sure, definitely,
yeah. I'm actually, since the pandemic, things have been a little more difficult. I would say travel is more difficult for sure, and things aren't quite back to normal. Although I guess they're getting there now. But it's been interesting. I mean, if I had to choose to take a sabbatical, it wouldn't have been when it was. During the pandemic, it was a sort of forced on everybody. It was great. I got a lot of work done, but
I know what you mean. Yeah. I think it's kind of now back, but because like the clubs and venues now finally got rid of the, you know, bookings that were made before.
Yes.
So now we're on the clear, I think, and we can start booking.
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah, so we'll see. But man, I will not take more of your time to give you a nice what is today? Sunday afternoon.
Okay,
Yeah, so you know, really appreciate sharing some of that stuff, and beautiful to hear
Thank you
talk
so
about
much.
it.
I'm glad you contacted me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man. And when you're in Europe, drop me a line. So
Absolutely. I haven't been to Maribor in a while. I need to get back
man,
there.
you need to get here for a session. Play on the drums. I have drums here, so we need to make a session.
All right.
Yeah. Cool, man. Michael, thanks so much once again, and take care.
Take care.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Bye.